So, if I was to describe myself as a writer, I would say I was someone who wrote in a minority marginal language that no one understands, Icelandic, spoken by 360,000 people. And that I've always been, maybe for that reason, interested in languages. And also in the sense, and you can see that, I think, in my writings, in my novel, that language is a powerful tool that is also misused in the world. It's used to gain power and to justify that power, and not necessarily to build bridges between people and to understand the other. So the paradox might be that obviously, being a writer, language is my tool, my working tool, but I doubt words. So I often seem to create characters, main persons that have some difficulties expressing themselves. You know, writing is, you have to downsize the big problems and to put everything on a human scale. You have to downsize it to a character, to a plot, to a situation. A novel, I always keep that in mind when I'm writing. A novel is not a reality. And it's never the whole story. It's always an extract of reality. And it's like, it's like a sauce you boil down and you end up with a strong extract. It's a bit like a child's drawing, a novel. It's one tree stands for a wood, one suffering soul for all suffering souls. So I'm very much aware of that. Fiction is a fictive reality, and everything you put in a story has to be there for a reason. I think of the reader in the sense that I'm holding their hand, and my goal is to make them finish the book. That would be excellent. That would make me happy. And so you have to create this safe space for them, and then you have to surprise them, and then you have to make them want to turn the page. And I have this very ambitious goal that maybe in the end they would have a different idea about themselves, something that has changed, something, tiny, and that they would maybe perhaps see the world a bit otherwise. Because reading is having multiple lives. Reading is sharing the lives of the others. I used to work full-time as a teacher, as an art historian, teaching at the university, and it was always my dream of becoming a full-time writer, but I couldn't live on it. I couldn't, I couldn't afford it, so I wrote my first novels in the evening, and when I had put my young children to bed. I started rather late, as a writer, as many women writers. I started like at 37. Before I was creating this new subject, art history, at the university that didn't exist before. And it became so popular and had so many students. But I always knew that I was going to write later. I was going to become a writer later, and I had those stories inside me. I just had to find time to get them out, and the voice, the right voice, and the maturity also as a person. I had to collect experience. I had to suffer a bit, But I'm so used of using the time well, because I had so little time to write that I can write anywhere, anytime, if I have 5 minutes, I can always, the imagination is always there. I don't have a working table. I have this old computer that's going to explode every minute. I've got that feeling. It gets very, very heated. I'm also cheating a bit because I'm always writing also when I'm not writing, because it's somewhere in the brain when I'm having a conversation or cooking or doing something, washing. It's always there in part of my brain. And because maybe I've been working full time as a teacher for such a long time, I feel the time is so precious. So for instance, like during the COVID isolation, I stayed in Iceland for 2.5 years, and that was so productive for me. It was the very creative time. So, and it was also the sense of something coming to an end. So I really had to get as many books out because they are all there. I just need like 500 years to accomplish them. And so I wrote like 3 novels. I wrote Dyreliv, Animal Life, and Eden, and the new one that's nearly finished. My hero, in the main character in Eden, she's trying to make her own little Eden by planting trees, and by doing that on a treeless island, on buying this land where nothing grows. It's the opposite of Eden, actually. But she's making up for something. And she's a linguist, a specialist in dying languages, minority languages, extinct languages. And she's been going to these conferences, abroad, to discuss dying languages. And like it says in one title of a chapter, every Friday a language dies in the world. There are around, if I remember right, 6,000 languages in the world, and every Friday or other Friday, one of them dies, and with each language a way of thinking and a culture. And by the end of this century, if this goes on, 90% of the languages will be extinct. And Icelandic, as being a minority language, could very well be one of those. And obviously, because my hero lives on an island, she has to take an aeroplane. She can't travel otherwise. So she's making up for those traveling by planting trees, and she's also trying to kind of simplify her life at the same time on this treeless island. My character is not she's not a perfect person, so she has actually had this love affair with a student of her at the university, and because when flesh or the body enters in my novels, there's often no thinking. She doesn't. When she reflects on it, she doesn't understand what she was thinking, and she comes to the conclusion that she wasn't thinking. That's what I often do in my novels, to kind of confront body, flesh, and the language. There is rational thinking, there's analyzing, there's the language, and then there is no thinking. Because actually language is just a tiny part of how we communicate, how we express ourselves. My main issue is to find something new about human nature in every novel, and the paradoxes that make us human. A couple of years ago, in this novel are. I tried to find out whether man was the only animal that cried or the only animal that laughed. And I found out man was the only animal that did both. And then in dyrelief, animal life, man was the only animal that wrote poetry and stories. So, but in that novel, I was trying to compare man as animal, born naked, so fragile. How does this innocent, tiny, naked animal become the most cruel animal of all? So I was trying to, somehow the underlying idea was that the fragility of man could also in some way save him, because man has 5 times bigger brain than he should have, according to the size of the body. Man can find solutions to problems. Man can solve problems if he wants to. So that's a bit of a hope, you know. So there's always this underlying, well, it's not politics, it's fiction, but there is this underlying, especially in my last 2 novels, climate issues, the climate crisis. And because I think man's greed and ignorance can show us something interesting about human nature. I'm not sure the powerful people in the world, those who are in power, they read literature. I don't think they have neither interest or time to read, because literature is something that needs time. It's not like the social media, and it makes you think. I think they're just too busy with other things. I think everything has been said, actually. So we don't need words anymore, just actions. We know what to do. We know what the problem is. So a writer doesn't have to tell the reader. A reader knows, that opens a book, knows certain things. You don't have to remind them of those problems. A writer can have an idea of, for instance, when I started to write in Icelandic, it's called Hotel Silence in most languages. I decided to write a novel about suffering and pain, man's suffering and pain in the world. But again, downsized to one suffering soul, and a handyman, an archetype for a bit Icelandic masculinity, able to repair everything but himself, fix everything but himself. It might have something to do with the, since I mentioned this novel are, with the tragic essence of the Icelandic sense of humor. It's like our survival kit during the centuries. You can see that in this black humor to deal with too much pain, to deal with too much suffering. And that's also part of my writing process. It's a kind of soothing myself and also the reader. And because, life is chaotic. It's unexpected things are happening all the time. It's like the Icelandic weather changing, all the time. Life is taking you by the surprises. But a novel is something constructed. It's a microcosm. It's a whole. It has its own rules. A writer is someone who organizes the chaos of the world and gives it a meaning. So that's maybe what I mean by saying soothing myself, trying to make something that makes sense, even if it's just an extract of reality, even if it's just a fictive world, it has its own laws. It has a beginning, it has an end, and it has a middle part. And that's not how life is. Well, life, you have beginning, you have the end. That was maybe one of the ideas about with my latest novel, Eden, a novel about things that we are losing, like languages and nature. That was a kind of consoling the reader by asking, what is there something an ordinary person like us can do while waiting for the apocalypse, while waiting for the end of the world to happen? It will probably not be tonight. So what are we going to do until then? And one of the things I find so beautiful with humans, with human beings, is that how we try to somehow say to each other, it'll be all right. It's like when we talk to a traumatized child, you don't talk to this child. There's this refugees in my book, a teenager in Eden, and you don't talk to him about climate crisis. You don't tell him about the glaciers that are melting in Iceland, and all the biggest reservoir of fresh water we are losing. You just say it will be okay, it will be all right. And that's, the finishing sentence in the book. But of course, the reader knows better. And that's a bit my method, that the main character is always kind of a stranger to themselves, but the reader knows better. You don't really know where the idea comes from. Well, there can be like a scene, like a chapter, even a whole chapter that just appears like in a fraction of a second. You're walking, you're crossing a street, and you see it like an image. And it might be it's rarely the beginning of a novel. It's often, like the chapter 7 or something like that. And you write it down, but it takes like maybe 2 hours to write it down then. And that's where a character introduces him or herself, themselves, and you get curious to know more about that person. To read, what do I prefer to read? Can I say dictionaries? I've always, been so interested in languages, and I remember having when I got my first dictionary as a present, I started by A. I just read it, foreign language dictionary, and somehow for me, for an Icelander, that was around the time I discovered I did not only live on an island that was, in the North Atlantic Ocean and had no neighbors other than the sea, but I spoke that language that was spoken by so few people. I was like 8 years old when I got this dictionary. I had an older sister, a teenager, a much older sister. She was in high school and she was studying German. And I asked her to teach me that. I was younger then, I was like 5. I asked her to teach me German. So she taught me one phrase in German, Ich bin ein Kind, I'm a child. And that was something that made a big impact on me, because Kind in Icelandic is a sheep. It somehow opened a new world for me of understanding that of communication and languages and differences of people, that this word in Icelandic could mean something else for people elsewhere. When I did my studies in Italy and in France, and when I learned, when I was able to read Italian and then French, I also a whole new world of reading opened to me, because those books were not translated into Icelandic. So few books were translated into Icelandic. And what I learned was that literature can be anything. You know, it's the total freedom. And it's probably my need for freedom, for liberty, that somehow made me a writer, because you can create the worlds you wish. You don't have to name your sources, like when you're an academic. It takes so much time to work with sources. You're so free. So and I started to read all kinds of readers that was so different from anything I had read before, like the French writer Hervé Guibert. He died young, sadly, of AIDS in the early 90s. He was so talented, so different from anyone else. Marguerite Duras, I had no idea she existed before I became a student in Paris. And then also the visual art has affected me a lot, and because I think actually I see and write a bit in images. So I could mention an artist like Pierre Soulages, a French artist that is known for his black paintings. Totally black, but different kinds of black. And the paintings of Soulages, they're all about light, because they're between the brush strokes, there are the delicate openings of, lights, because that's, how art works. That's how literature works. It goes by opposites.